The ghost town of Silverbrook held its breath, the silence as thick and heavy as the dust that coated every dead thing. And into that silence stepped Catherine Sullivan, her dark riding skirt clinging to curves that felt like a challenge to the pious desolation all around her. At 38, she moved with the coiled grace of a predator, a woman who had learned that survival meant your heart could hammer like a trapped bird against your ribs, but your face had to remain stone. She was a picture of dangerous beauty, and from the deep shadows of the abandoned general store, 24-year-old Jake Morrison watched her, feeling like he'd just stumbled into a story he had no business being in. His hands, calloused and young, gripped the reins of his horse. He was only here to do one thing: sell his father's legacy. 500 acres of Texas ranch land, so ravaged by drought it was more memory than property. He'd come to this forgotten place to bury his past and walk away with enough money to start over. He hadn't expected to see a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a high-dollar painting walk straight into a nest of rattlesnakes. Because that's what those five riders were, cresting the eastern ridge with the dying sun at their backs. Rattlesnakes on horseback. Blackjack Garrison and his crew. Their guns caught the last rays of light, glinting like broken promises. And the way they were looking at the widow Sullivan, well, it made the hairs on Jake's neck stand up. Jake had been raised on a simple creed. A decent man never ever lets a lady face danger alone. But he'd never been this close to a woman who wasn't his mother or sister, let alone one who made his pulse feel like a stampede and his mouth fill with cotton. He was just a boy with a broke-down ranch to sell. She was a woman who looked like she could own the world. And the men riding toward her looked like they were ready to burn that world down just to watch her burn with it. This was a bad place, on a bad day, and things were about to get a whole lot worse. Jake Morrison's father had taught him that a man was measured by two things: the weight of his word and the value of his land. Standing there in the dying light, with his land worth next to nothing and his word unspoken, Jake felt like he measured up to about zero. His father's lessons echoed in his head, spoken during long Texas nights under a blanket of stars so bright you felt you could reach up and steal one. But his father had never taught him what to do about a woman like Catherine Sullivan. He watched her smooth down her riding jacket, a simple, elegant movement that drew his eyes to a waist he could probably span with his two hands. Jake realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that his father's lessons had left out some very important chapters. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out rough, a stranger's voice scraping its way out of his own throat. He stepped from the shadows, feeling gangly and out of place. This might not be the safest place for a lady to be traveling alone. Catherine turned, and Jake felt the impact of it down to his boots. It was like getting kicked square in the chest by his own horse. Her eyes were the color of whiskey held up to a fire, and when she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, Jake thought, Lord Almighty, a man could forget his own name staring at a smile like that. "And you would be?" she asked, her voice like warm honey, tilting her head just so. The line of her throat was elegant, smooth, and for a second he couldn't think of a single word in the English language. "Jake Morrison, ma'am, from Texas." He remembered to touch the brim of his hat, a gesture his father had drilled into him. He was trying to breathe normally, but his lungs weren't cooperating. "And you'd be Mrs. Sullivan, I'm guessing." Her eyebrows, dark and perfectly arched, rose a fraction. "My reputation precedes me, it seems." "Your beauty does, ma'am," Jake said, and the words were out before he could stop them. Heat flooded his neck, crawling up his face like a brush fire. Sweet Jesus, did I say that out loud? But Catherine's laugh wasn't mocking. It was like silver bells carried on a summer wind, and it disarmed him completely. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her smile widening, "I do believe you're blushing." She took a step closer, then another. She stopped right in front of him, so close he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair, feel the impossible warmth of her skin. The air crackled between them. Before he could make an even bigger fool of himself, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the quiet. The moment was shattered. 5 riders materialized from the desert haze, their faces as hard and unforgiving as the land that had shaped them. At their head was a man who sat his horse like it was a throne. His eyes were cold, flat chips of obsidian, and they were fixed on Catherine with the hungry intensity of a wolf. "Well, well," the man sneered, his voice like gravel grinding on bone. "Mrs. Catherine Sullivan, I thought you'd have learned your lesson after what happened to your dear, departed husband." Every muscle in Jake's body went taut. He'd heard whispers about the Garrison gang, stories told in hushed tones about mines they'd seized, about people who stood in their way and simply disappeared. Looking at Catherine now, at the hard set of her jaw, the way her hands had clenched into tight fists at her sides, he knew those stories were not just true. They were the polite version. "I told you before, Garrison," Catherine said, and her voice was as steady as bedrock, though Jake thought he saw a faint tremor in her hands. "The Sullivan mine is not for sale." "Everything's for sale, sweetheart," Blackjack sneered, his smile all teeth and no warmth. "Just depends on the price." He let his cold gaze drift from her face, down her body, and back up again, an insult more profound than any curse. "And sometimes," he added softly, "that price gets paid in blood." That was it. That was the line. Jake moved without thinking, stepping directly between them. His hand didn't go for his gun, not yet. It just rested on the grip of his Colt, a casual, easy posture that belied the thunder in his veins. This wasn't bravado. His father had taught him to shoot before he could properly ride a horse, and Jake had never missed what he aimed at. But he'd also never drawn on another man. He'd never felt the suffocating weight of another man's life hanging in the balance. "The lady said no," Jake said, his voice quiet but carrying in the dead air. "Seems to me that should be the end of it." Blackjack Garrison threw his head back and laughed, a sound as ugly as a vulture's cry. "Boy," he spat, his eyes narrowing on Jake, "you don't even know what game you're stepping into. This is business between adults." "Then maybe you should start acting like one," Jake replied, and he felt, more than saw, Catherine's sharp intake of breath beside him. A strange thing happened then. Blackjack's ugly smile faltered. For just a second, he glanced from Jake to Catherine and back again. A flicker of something that wasn't anger crossed his face. It almost looked like confusion, or maybe pity. "You really don't get it, do you, kid?" Blackjack said, shaking his head slowly. "You think this is about a worthless mine?" He laughed again, a low, bitter sound. "That mine is played out. There ain't enough silver left in that hole to make a cufflink. I don't want her mine." Jake frowned. "Then what do you want?" "I want what her husband found," Blackjack said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The thing he hid down there before he had his accident." He locked eyes with Catherine. "The thing you've come back for." Jake looked at Catherine. Her face was a perfect, unreadable mask, but her whiskey-colored eyes were blazing. The story she was telling and the story Blackjack was telling were two very different tales, and Jake was standing right in the middle of them. The first shot wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. The evening silence shattered like breaking glass. Instinct took over. Jake grabbed Catherine's hand. Her fingers were slender but surprisingly strong in his, and hauled her toward the gaping maw of the old saloon. Bullets whined past their heads, chewing splinters from the sun-bleached wood of the storefronts. He felt the trembling in her hand, a vibration she was trying desperately to conceal. "In here!" he yelled, shouldering through the creaking, bat-wing doors and pulling her into the dusty gloom. Inside, ghosts of laughter and piano music hung in the air. Overturned tables and broken chairs littered the floor, silent witnesses to the town's last violent days. It wasn't much, but it was cover. Catherine pressed her back against the long mahogany bar, her chest rising and falling in a way that made Jake's mouth go dry all over again, despite the mortal danger they were in. "You didn't have to do that," she gasped, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Yes," Jake said, his voice flat as he automatically checked the rounds in his Colt. "I did." His movements were quick, economical, the muscle memory of 100 hours of practice kicking in. "My father taught me that a man who won't stand up for what's right isn't much of a man at all." "And what makes you think," she said, her voice dropping, becoming softer, more intimate, "that I'm worth standing up for?" The question hung in the air between them, vulnerable and sharp. It snagged something deep in Jake's chest. He stopped what he was doing and really looked at her. The dying light filtering through the grimy windows caught the gold threads in her dark hair. He saw the proud, defiant set of her shoulders, even as she leaned against the bar for support. He saw lips that were full and soft and made him think of things a decent man had no business thinking about during a gunfight. "Because you're here, aren't you?" he said, his voice low. "Because you could have sold out. You could have taken their money, whatever they were offering, and been safe somewhere else. But you didn't. You came back." Something shifted in her expression. The mask cracked. The air between them suddenly felt charged, thick with unspoken things, like the moments right before a lightning strike. "You don't know me, Mr. Morrison," she whispered. "Maybe not," Jake said, and he took a step closer, breaking his own rule about keeping a safe distance. "But I know courage when I see it, and I know beauty when it takes my breath away." He felt like a fool saying it, but it was the truest thing he'd ever said. Outside, the gang had them surrounded. Their voices carried through the broken windows, rough and ugly as they debated the best way to smoke them out or burn them down. Jake moved to the front window, his rifle now in his hands, ready. He expected Catherine to cower behind the bar. Instead, she moved to a side window, and that's when he saw it. A small, elegant derringer appeared in her hand, and she held it with the steady, practiced confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Sullivan," Jake murmured, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A woman in my position learns to take care of herself," she replied, her eyes scanning the street. Then she glanced at him sideways, a hint of that devastating smile playing on her lips. "Though I have to admit, it's been a long time since a man stood up for me just because it was the right thing to do." "Your husband didn't?" The question was out before he could stop it. Too personal, too damn familiar. Her smile vanished. "My husband was a good man," she said, her voice tight. "But he was also a practical man. He would have negotiated, tried to find a compromise." Her voice caught on the last word, a tiny, almost imperceptible break. "That's what got him killed." A hot, clean anger surged through Jake. "They killed him," he stated. It wasn't a question. "They made it look like an accident," she said, her knuckles white where she gripped the small pistol. "A cave-in at the mine. But Thomas was careful, meticulously careful. He wouldn't have been in that tunnel unless someone forced him." Before Jake could respond, Blackjack's voice boomed from across the street, dripping with false reason. "You've got 1 minute to send out the widow, boy. This doesn't have to be your fight." Jake met Catherine's eyes in the gathering dark. They were no longer the color of whiskey and fire. They were the color of a gathering storm, fierce and beautiful and terrified. Without thinking, without planning, he reached out and touched her face. His calloused thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, a stark contrast to her smooth skin. "It became my fight," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "The moment I saw you." For one breathtaking second, Catherine leaned into his touch. Her eyes fluttered closed, a silent surrender. When she opened them again, Jake saw something in their depths that made the blood sing in his veins. It was want, pure and unvarnished, mixed with a gratitude so profound, it felt like a physical blow. "Jake," she whispered. Hearing his given name on her lips was both a prayer and a curse. He might have kissed her then. God knows he wanted to. He wanted to taste the courage and the fear and the fight on her lips. But the sharp, violent crash of splintering wood from the back of the saloon announced their time was up. The discussion was over. Blackjack wasn't waiting any longer. He and two of his men burst through the shattered back door just as the others opened fire on the front windows. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of noise. The roar of gunfire, the scream of ricochets, the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder. Jake's training, the endless hours his father had spent drilling him, took over. He wasn't thinking. He was reacting. He rolled behind a heavy, overturned poker table, the rifle coming to his shoulder as if it were an extension of his own arm. He returned fire. His first shot was aimed. It took one of the gang members high in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the dust. His second shot was hurried, but it was enough to make Blackjack himself dive for cover behind the bar. cursing a blue streak. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. While the men were locked in a deadly exchange of gunfire, focused entirely on Jake, Catherine moved. She didn't scream or hide. She slipped around the end of the bar, silent as a cat, her small derringer held tight. With shocking speed, she pressed the muzzle of the gun against the neck of the third man, the one who had been about to flank Jake. "Drop your weapons," she said, and her voice was no longer soft or vulnerable. It was cold steel, hard as a coffin nail. "Or I will paint this wall with his brains." The man froze, the whites of his eyes showing. Even Blackjack stopped shooting, peering over the top of the bar. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He'd been outmaneuvered by a woman. "You think you've won something here?" he snarled, his voice venomous. "You think any of this matters? The mine's worthless, I told you. Played out. There's nothing in it but dust and holes in the ground." "Then why do you want it so badly, Garrison?" Catherine asked, her voice dangerously calm. The gun didn't waver an inch. "Because it's the principle of the thing," he roared, his frustration boiling over. "Because what's mine is mine, and you can't just—" Jake's rifle cut him off. The shot was a punctuation mark at the end of Blackjack's sentence. The bullet tore through Blackjack's shoulder, spinning him around like a top. The gang leader went down hard, his pistol clattering across the filthy floorboards. "Principle," Jake said, levering another round into the chamber with a satisfying shuck click. He stood up from behind the table, his rifle held ready. "Funny thing about principles, they tend to look different depending on which end of the gun you're on." The remaining gang members, seeing their leader down and their companion held hostage, threw down their weapons, their hands shooting into the air. It was over, for now. But Jake had a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the end of the game. It was just the end of the first move. In the ringing silence that followed, with the outlaws bound and gagged with strips of curtain, Catherine finally lowered her derringer. The immediate danger was past, and the adrenaline began to drain away, leaving her hands shaking. She stared at the small, deadly pistol in her palm, as if seeing it for the first time. "I can't go back," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't go back to the way things were, always looking over my shoulder, always being afraid." Jake holstered his Colt and moved to stand beside her at the bar. He was so close now he could see the frantic pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. He could feel the waves of heat radiating from her skin. "So don't," he said simply. She looked up at him then, and in the storm-colored depths of her eyes, Jake saw his own raw, desperate need reflected back at him, a hunger for something real, something clean and honest in a world that seemed hell-bent on grinding all the hope out of decent people. "I could buy your ranch," she said, the words rushing out of her, sudden and shocking. "The deed you came here to sign. I could pay off your debts, give you a fresh start." Jake's heart, which had just started to slow down, began hammering against his ribs again. We could rebuild this place," she continued, her gaze sweeping around the ruined saloon. "Make it live again." "Kate," he started, the name feeling foreign and yet perfectly right on his tongue. "I know it's crazy," she said, her voice shaking slightly now. "I know you barely know me, and I barely know you, but—" She stopped, biting her lower lip in a way that nearly sent Jake to his knees. "But I haven't felt this alive in years, and life is too short to let fear make all our decisions for us." He reached out, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. He cupped her face in his hands, his rough palms a stark contrast to her porcelain skin. He marveled at the softness, at the way she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "My father always said a man's land was his legacy," Jake said, his voice thick. "But maybe some legacies are worth more than dirt and dust." And then he kissed her. It was soft at first, a gentle, questioning touch. But her response was like striking a match to dry tinder. A fire banked for years roared to life. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her body pressing against his until there was no space left between them. She tasted of whiskey and wildness, of gunpowder and impossible promises. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless and trembling, Jake rested his forehead against hers. The world had tilted on its axis. Nothing was the same as it had been an hour ago. "So," he murmured, his voice hoarse, "what happens now?" Catherine pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, a sunrise breaking through the storm clouds. "Now," she said, "we find out what my husband was really looking for in that mine." The twist landed like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about rebuilding a town. It wasn't about starting over. It was about finishing a fight. Her fight. And she had just recruited him to her cause. The bound and gagged Blackjack Garrison, slumped against the bar, started to laugh. A muffled, choking sound. He was laughing at Jake. He was laughing at the biggest fool in the territory. 6 months later, the ghost town of Silverbrook was a ghost no more. The air, once thick with silence and decay, now rang with the sound of hammers and saws. New buildings rose from the ashes of the old, their fresh-cut lumber smelling of pine and promise. But it wasn't a town reborn of hope. It was a town fortified, an armed camp. The Sullivan mine, as it turned out, held no silver. Blackjack had been telling the truth about that. What it did hold was a secret far more valuable and far more dangerous. Thomas Sullivan hadn't been a simple prospector. He had been a government agent, a Pinkerton detective investigating a smuggling ring that ran all the way to the top. The mine wasn't a mine, it was a hiding place. And the treasure wasn't a precious metal, it was a ledger, a book filled with names, dates, and shipments that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the territory. Men who would kill to keep their secrets buried. Men who had killed Thomas. And now they were coming for Catherine. Jake Morrison stood on the porch of the hastily repaired saloon, which now served as their barracks. He watched Catherine as she instructed a group of hired guns on how to set up a defensive perimeter. She moved with that same dangerous grace that had first captivated him, but now it was honed to a razor's edge. There was no softness in her, not anymore. She was a general commanding her army, and Jake, he was her lieutenant. He'd sold his father's land, his legacy, not for a fresh start, but to buy guns and ammunition, to hire men with cold eyes and fast hands. He was no longer the blushing boy from Texas. Silverbrook had burned that part of him away. Catherine caught him watching and walked over, her face set in grim lines. The smile that could make him forget his own name was a distant memory. "They'll be here by nightfall," she said, her voice flat. "The telegraph wire was cut an hour ago. That means Marshal Thompson is on his way." Marshal Thompson, the lawman from the next county over, the man whose name was at the very top of the list in Thomas Sullivan's ledger. "Let them come," Jake said, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. It felt like a permanent part of him now. "We're ready." "Are we, Jake?" she asked, and for the first time in months he saw a flicker of the woman she'd been, or the woman she'd pretended to be, a flicker of vulnerability. "Are we ready to die for a book full of names?" He looked at her, at this woman who had turned his entire world upside down. He had come here to sell a piece of land and ended up in the middle of a private war. He had fallen for a damsel in distress who turned out to be a master manipulator. He should have hated her. He should have ridden away the moment he learned the truth. But he hadn't. "My father taught me that a man who won't stand up for what's right isn't much of a man at all," he said quietly, echoing the words he'd spoken on that first fateful day. "It seems your husband was one of those men. That's a legacy worth fighting for." Her expression softened for a brief moment. "Thomas was a fool," she whispered, a deep old pain surfacing in her eyes. "He believed in things like justice and honor. Look where it got him." "It got him a wife who won't let his fight die with him," Jake countered. "It got him a legacy after all." The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red. The sounds of preparation died down, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Far off in the distance, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. A big one. They were coming. Jake and Catherine stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching the approaching dust cloud. Two lone figures against a dying world. This wasn't a love story, it was a ghost story, and they were all about to find out who would be left to haunt this town when the sun came up. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into a posse of at least 30 riders, led by a man on a big bay horse, Marshall Thompson. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who believed the law was whatever he said it was. He reined in his horse just outside of rifle range, the setting sun glinting off the star on his chest. "Catherine Sullivan!" His voice boomed across the empty street. "You are harboring known fugitives. You are in possession of stolen property. Come out now with your hands in the air." Catherine let out a short, bitter laugh. "Stolen property," she murmured to Jake. "He means my husband's evidence." "He's got more men than we do," Jake said, his eyes scanning the disciplined line of riders. These weren't drunken thugs like Blackjack's crew. These were hard men, deputies and hired guns who knew their business. "We can't win a straight fight." "Who said anything about fighting straight?" Catherine said, a dangerous glint in her eye. She turned to one of the hired guns. "Now!" A moment later, an explosion rocked the far end of the town. A plume of black smoke billowed into the sky. It was the livery stable. Marshall Thompson's men all turned toward the sound, their discipline momentarily broken. And in that moment of distraction, Jake's riflemen, hidden in the second-story windows of the surrounding buildings, opened fire. The trap was sprung. Men and horses screamed and went down in a chaotic tangle. Thompson roared orders, trying to regain control, but the initial volley had been devastating. It had evened the odds considerably. The fight for Silverbrook had begun. Bullets tore through the air, the town becoming a shooting gallery. Jake fought with a cold, detached efficiency, his rifle barking, another rider falling from his saddle. But for every one of Thompson's men they took down, another seemed to take his place, pushing forward, using the buildings for cover. Then the unthinkable happened. From behind them, from inside the town they thought was secure, came a second volley of gunfire. It ripped through their own ranks. Jake spun around, his blood running cold. Blackjack Garrison, his arm in a sling, stood in the doorway of the assayer's office, a smoking pistol in his good hand. With him were the three surviving members of his old gang. They had been locked in the town jail. Someone had let them out. Someone had given them guns. Betrayal. It was a cold knife in the gut. They were caught in a crossfire, pinned down between the Marshall's posse and Blackjack's resurrected gang. It was a massacre. One by one, their hired guns fell. "The mine!" Catherine screamed at Jake over the din of the battle. "It's our only way out." They fell back, running from building to building, providing covering fire for each other. They finally reached the entrance to the Sullivan mine, the dark maw promising a desperate temporary safety. As they scrambled inside, Jake looked back. He saw Marshall Thompson and Blackjack Garrison meet in the middle of the street. They weren't fighting. They were shaking hands. It had all been a setup, from the very beginning. Blackjack's initial attack hadn't been a failed attempt to get the ledger. It had been a performance, a carefully staged drama designed to lure Catherine into a false sense of security, to make her fortify the town, to gather all her resources in one place so Thompson could wipe them all out at once. Her husband hadn't been the only one who believed in justice. She had too, and just like him, that belief had led her straight into a trap. Deep inside the mine, with the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them, they lit a lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the damp rock walls. "He played me," Catherine said, her voice hollow with defeat. She leaned against the wall, the fight gone out of her. The whole time he was working for Thompson. "How did he get out of the jail?" Jake asked, reloading his pistol, his mind racing. "There was only one key, and I had it." He patted his pockets, then froze. The key wasn't there. He remembered bumping into one of the hired guns near the jailhouse earlier that day. A man named Silas, a quiet man who kept to himself. The man had apologized and moved on. A pickpocket. Silas hadn't been their man. He'd been Thompson's, planted in their crew from the start. "They knew every move we were going to make," Jake said, the full weight of the deception crashing down on him. They hadn't just been outgunned. They had been outsmarted. "There's another way out of here," Catherine said, pushing herself off the wall, a flicker of her old fire returning. "A ventilation shaft on the other side of the mountain. Thomas showed it to me once. It's a long shot, but it's the only one we've got." They navigated the dark, twisting tunnels, following Catherine's memory. The air grew stale and thin. Finally, they reached a narrow shaft leading straight up. A rusty iron ladder was bolted to the side. "This is it," she said. Jake looked up. It was a long climb, and they had no idea what would be waiting for them at the top. But it was better than waiting to die in the dark. Jake went first, his rifle slung over his back. The ladder was old, groaning, and shifting under his weight. Rung by rung, he climbed toward a small patch of starry sky. He was almost to the top when he heard it, the sound of scraping boots from above. He froze, pressing himself against the ladder, his heart pounding in his ears. A face appeared in the opening above him, silhouetted against the night sky. It was Silas, the quiet man, the traitor. He was holding a shotgun, and it was pointed straight down at Jake's head. "End of the line, Morrison," Silas said, his voice calm. "The marshal sends his regards." From below in the darkness of the mine, Catherine screamed his name. Silas smiled, a cruel, ugly thing. His finger tightened on the trigger. There was nowhere to go, no way to dodge. This was how it ended, betrayed in the dark, at the bottom of a hole. But just as Silas was about to fire, another voice cut through the night. A new voice. "Drop the gun, son, or the next thing you hear will be a harp." Silas's eyes widened in shock. He looked away from Jake, toward the source of the voice. And in that split second of distraction, Jake acted. He lunged upward, grabbing the barrels of the shotgun and yanking with all his might. Silas was pulled off balance, screaming as he toppled forward into the black emptiness of the shaft. His scream was cut short by a sickening thud far below. Jake hauled himself out of the shaft, gasping for breath. He looked over to see an old man with a long white beard, holding an even longer buffalo rifle. The man looked like a prospector or a mountain hermit. "Took you long enough," the old man grunted. "Who the hell are you?" Jake managed to ask. "Name's Elias Vance," the man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "And I used to be the sheriff of Silverbrook, before it went to hell." He nodded back toward the town, where the sounds of gunfire had now been replaced by the triumphant shouts of Thompson's men. "Looks like I came out of retirement just in time." Catherine emerged from the shaft, her face pale but her eyes blazing with questions. "You knew?" she asked Elias. "You knew they were coming?" "I knew someone was," Elias said grimly. "Thomas Sullivan sent me a letter a week before he died. Told me if anything happened to him, a ledger was hidden in his mine. Told me his wife might come looking for it. Told me not to trust the law in this county." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Thomas hadn't been a fool. He had been careful. He had a contingency plan, a ghost from the past, waiting in the hills. "He also told me something else," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "He said the ledger in the mine was a fake." Jake and Catherine stared at him, stunned into silence. "A fake." "The real one," Elias continued. "The one with the railroad baron's name in it, the one that proves the whole conspiracy. He mailed it to a post office box in St. Louis. He told me the claim ticket was hidden somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look." "Where?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. Elias Vance looked at Catherine, a strange, sad smile on his weathered face. He had it sewn into the lining of his wife's favorite riding jacket. Catherine's hands flew to the jacket she was wearing, the one she had worn every day since his death, the one she had been wearing when she first arrived in Silverbrook. Frantically, she tore at the silk lining near the collar. Her fingers found a small, hard square of paper stitched deep inside the fabric. A postal claim ticket. It had been with her the entire time. The gunfights, the betrayals, the deaths. It had all been for a decoy. Her husband had played a longer game than any of them had realized. He hadn't just left her a mission. He had made her the key. Suddenly, the triumphant shouts from the town below were cut short by a new sound. A bugle call, clear and sharp in the night air. And then another, and another. From the east, a long column of dark shapes was approaching at a gallop. United States Cavalry. They rode into Silverbrook with sabers drawn, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the dusty grays of the marshal's men. Thompson and his posse, caught completely by surprise, were surrounded in minutes. Standing on the mountainside, watching the scene unfold below, Jake turned to Elias. "How?" Elias Vance grinned, showing a distinct lack of teeth. Turns out the Army's been looking to build a new fort out here. They've been trying to buy up land. I might have sent them a telegram this morning about a certain 500-acre parcel of Texas ranch land that was for sale. Mentioned it was currently occupied by a large group of hostile squatters impersonating lawmen. Jake stared at him. Then slowly, a grin spread across his own face. His father's land. His worthless legacy. It had saved them all. It turned out to be the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Marshall Thompson and Blackjack Garrison were arrested. The fake ledger was enough to hold them, and, with the claim ticket, Catherine now had the power to bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. Justice, it turned out, was coming for Silverbrook after all. In the quiet dawn that followed, Jake and Catherine stood on the porch of the saloon, watching the cavalry lead the prisoners away. The town was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of a new beginning. "He used me," Catherine said softly, her hand unconsciously touching the collar of her jacket. "Thomas. He made me a part of his plan without ever telling me. He didn't trust me." "He didn't want you to be a target," Jake said. "He was protecting you, in the only way he knew how." He looked at her, at this impossible, complicated woman who had dragged him into hell and back. The lines of deception and truth had blurred so much, he wasn't sure what was real anymore. All he knew was what he felt. "So," he said, his voice quiet, "the offer, to buy my ranch. Was that real, or just another part of the plan?" Catherine turned to face him. The sun was rising, chasing the last of the shadows from her face. She looked tired and wounded, but for the first time she looked completely, utterly real. "The offer is real, Jake," she said. "The Pinkerton Agency is going to need a permanent base of operations in this territory. A place run by people who know the land. People who can't be bought." She took a step closer, her whiskey-colored eyes searching his. "I'm going to need a partner. Someone I can trust." Jake thought about his father's legacy. He'd always thought it was about holding on to a piece of land. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe a real legacy wasn't something you owned. Maybe it was something you built. He looked out at the battered, bruised town of Silverbrook, and for the first time, he didn't see a ghost town. He saw a future. "All right, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You've got yourself a partner." When she kissed him this time, it wasn't the desperate, fiery kiss from the saloon. It was something else entirely. It was a promise. A deal sealed not with a handshake, but with the shared understanding of two survivors who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, changed forever. Sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't buried in the ground. They're the secrets we carry and the courage it takes to bring them into the light. If this story of frontier justice and hidden truths kept you on the edge of your seat, do us a favor and hit that like button. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because every town has a story and every hero has a secret.